interesting. If a Martian came, though, say 10,000 years ago or 20,000 years ago, would the Martian make the same kind of claims about the species?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it wouldn't obviously be nearly as striking. I mean, the great um, uh, technologies of production, the changes occurred from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic. In other words, when you stopped gathering, creaming off the surface, hunting and using things that naturally grew, to actually speeding up the process. In other words, domesticating animals and domesticating plant species. And at that point, you move from a shift from hunters and gatherers to
Hmm.
tribal peoples about 10, 15,000 years ago. And there are elements of it much earlier, back 50,000 years ago. And that, once that had occurred, in other words, if they'd come, say, 10,000 years ago, they might have said, well, this is different from the other animals on this planet, because other animals just predate on what's there naturally. This species alone seems now to be speeding up production in some curious way. And maybe that is a key to something that will happen importantly in the future.
Hmm. And one of the, obviously, again, big shifts is the shift from, if you like, agraria, as Gellner called it, to industria. The industrial revolution stuff, which again, a Martian you might be forgiven for thinking that what we're doing now is very different from even what the Romans were doing, or even the Egyptians, or these mega empires and cultures of the past, just in terms of the technological changes that are going on continually all the time. Would that be right?
Well, it's both right and wrong. On the one hand, making an absolute break, which what Gellner called the great ditch, people on that side and this side, that's not right. There are many things in Roman civilization which are highly efficient technologies and which we still use.
Mm.
Or again, something I know more about medieval England. If you looked at medieval England, it's a highly technologically sophisticated civilization where every human being has two or three other human beings working for them, not slaves, but animals
Mm.
and wind power. The first windmills were discovered in England. Um, Water power. My village has an ancient water mill, and most villages in Doomsday Book had water mills. And also already the use of coal quite extensively in medieval England right through. So 800 years ago, I remember there was an article I read long ago by an economic historian called Carus Wilson. It was called The First Industrial Revolution. And I thought, well, this is going to be set in the 18th century. It was the 13th century. It
Right.
was a fulling mill. It was a water-driven mill for making cloth. And so it's a continuous, the it's exponential, and there's a point at which more is a real shift and change. And the 18th century,
Mm.
not to downplay the Industrial Revolution, the application of steam power
Yeah.
to production processes is a real revolution. On the other hand, it's a continuation of a real divergence between England, more or less alone in the world, and the rest of the world, because England moved towards industry, that is replacing humans with other forms of energy very early on. All other civilizations, and it's not just China, Japan, but even France and Spain, they move towards what Hayami calls an industrious civilization. You get more by working more. I mean, studies, for example, of medieval to modern Europe, Southern Europe, shows that it de-industrialized, that peasants in 18th, 19th century Spain had less tools, less animals, less non-human power than they did 300 or 400 years earlier. It went towards what Clifford Geertz, the anthropologist, calls agricultural involution. not evolution, but you pile in the labor, you have more and more people, they work harder and harder, but it doesn't lead to a breakthrough of the kind that occurred on this island. Now, Ernest never really understood technology. He wasn't really interested in it. I remember struggling with him to try and teach him how to use a computer. And he really didn't like machines very much. He wasn't interested in them. And I remember a rather clever, typical Ernest phrase. He made a distinction between, there was a device in 17th century, 18th century opera where a kind of, the gods would come down in a machine. You get it in one of Mozart's operas. Deus ex machina, God in a machine. And of course, Ernest, being clever, he said the Industrial Revolution was the reverse of this, machina ex deus. God gave us machines. And he didn't really wonder about the question of why he gave us, or how he gave us, or how these machines came about. But he said, this is the key, by some chance, it wasn't predestined, God, and then we had machines, and then we had in nationalism, and we had the modern world. Well, it wasn't like that. It was a complete fluke. It was a 1 in a million chance that this would happen, but it did happen. And a lot of my life's work have been about why the Industrial Revolution occurred on this island, not elsewhere, not even in Holland. You see, Holland was a high-level commercial civilization, very effective with a lot of water and wind power. But it burnt peat. This was the great argument of Wrigley and others, which didn't give it the energy that you get from coal. But I think there were other things. It was turning towards making profits from trade. Its great companies and manufacturing were in that sphere rather than in the agricultural developments of this country and the industrial developments. So I think this Martian coming, I remember one of Jerry Martin's lovely ideas was that we should set up a kind of thought experiment, or even a real museum. We would lay out trestle tables. We'd have lots of tables. And on it, we would put artifacts, because he was very interested in actual physical artifacts. He collected things. He used to go around with a Neolithic stone, which had been shaped, thousands of years ago, and say, this is one of the first tools. They'd actually chipped this into a tool. This is the beginning of technology. And he said, on these trestle tables, you would lay out objects, new objects. And what you would see is it would immediately reveal to you a strange pattern, which is that for long periods, so nothing, you just have the same sort of objects being found over 1,000 years, 2,000 years. Suddenly, there would be a burst of activity. I mean, the famous bursts of activity in the West are obviously the Romans, the great technocrats, medieval, early modern Italy, the Renaissance period, Holland to a certain extent, and the British, Sung China, 12th, 13th century China. So in different civilizations, you suddenly have for 100, 200 years a great burst, and then it goes back. And of course, the great mystery about, say, Islamic civilization, which had one of these bursts between the 8th and the 12th century, or Chinese civilization, which had a great burst in the 12th, 13th century, is all these objects are there, bursting away, and then you move to the next table and there's nothing. It just goes on. And often the objects are forgotten. I mean, one of the great examples is the Susung clock, the 11th century clock invented in China with possibly an escapement, which is the secret of a Western clock, which regulates time in a mechanical way. And then if you'd looked for this great, wonderful, huge clock 100 years later, it had been broken into pieces and no one was interested in it. Or you looked at glass manufacture and you looked at glass in the 9th century all over the world. It was roughly similar in India and China and Japan and the West. But 500 years later, it had disappeared more or less in East Asia and in the Middle East, where it was great earlier on. But in one part of the world, it went on. So the disappearance and the emergence of technologies is something that is really important and fascinating, I found.